All right, in this lecture, we're going to continue with a discussion of various forms of cognition. However, this lesson focused specifically on language development. So let me pull up that lecture and we'll be off to the races. So to start, when we talk about language development, there are different components. So the first component of interest is called phonology. And the root of the word phonology is phone or phoneme. And when we use that term, that implies a sound, a part of language that deals with sounds. So here, when we talk about phonology, we're trying to break down flow of speech into words, and the words come based on different syllables or sounds. Now, sounds get put together into words. And the next part of language is called semantics. And when we say semantics, now we're trying to understand the meaning of a given word. And you might have heard this phrase, oh, we're arguing over semantics. Well, when someone says, oh, we're arguing over semantics, you're arguing over nuance or the meaning of a word. So we tend to see that preschoolers try and figure out the meaning of words by connecting them with other words that they might know. Then we have the issue of grammar, and grammar occurs in two different ways. One is syntax. Well, we put words together to make sentences. So how you string words together is syntax. And then morphology, this would be more about conjugation of verbs, understanding gender and whatnot. So things like the present tense of laughs versus past tense laughed would be an example of that. And last but not least, there's a final part, or the fifth part of language, which we talk of as pragmatics. And pragmatics are kind of the unwritten rules of language, such as emphasis, sarcasm, and whatnot, which sometimes what you say isn't always what you mean, and pragmatics is your ability to determine that. So examples of pragmatics also include taking turns. These are unwritten rules, but if people talk over one another, you can't really understand. So if you watch the first presidential debate, you would see both candidates were talking over one another. And largely, most people didn't understand what the heck they were saying. Why? Because each person cut in on the other, and it just came across as sort of like white noise. Another aspect of pragmatic is to remain focused on a topic. Things like gestures, tone of voice also add value. And then we have something called sociolinguistic knowledge, such as the social scripts that when we come into a room, we say hello. When we leave a room, we say goodbye. And that's an example of sociolinguistic language. So how does language develop? Well, there are different positions on how language develops, but the first position comes from B.F. Skinner. And you may have heard of Skinner as the founding father of operant conditioning. And operant conditioning suggests that a behavior is governed by its consequences. So things like when a baby makes a sound, the parents cheer and reinforce the child making more sounds. And ultimately, the child will say words. And then when the child says words, then the parent is going to refine the words, help them pronounce the words a little bit better. And that is an example of how parents shape language development through reinforcement. You also have the component of imitation. So you may have heard the phrase, kids say the darndest things. Well, guess what? They don't say the darndest things. They say the things that you say after hearing you, and they repeat it. And sometimes you might say, well, who taught you that? Well, you are their teacher, both good and bad. So avoid profanity, avoid harmful speech, and so forth, because ultimately they're going to copy you. Now, you could also combine imitation with reinforcement to further shape language development. Now, one major criticism of the behaviorist point of view is that if you were to strictly use reinforcement and imitation and modeling, you would have to spend all day, every day, for the first 6 years of life in order to get kids to speak the way they do. So, and that doesn't happen, obviously, right? So we have to think about other ways to explain language development. All right. Another example of a criticism on behaviorism is that kids tend to say things that they didn't hear. So if it's about modeling and them just repeating what you said, how do they say unique things or creative things that they've never heard? So I will tell you that behaviorism is part of the process of language development, but it is not sufficient to fully explain language development. The other approach, or the other common approach you might have heard about, is called the Nativist approach. This comes from Noam Chomsky, and he suggests that really it's not the reinforcement that promotes language development. It's the fact that we as human beings are wired with a unique and intrinsic potential for language development, whereas other animal models do not. And believe me, we have tried to teach language to virtually any organism that makes a sound. So, what's his rationale? Right. So, the rules of language are way too complex to be taught and reinforced, even by an intelligent or sophisticated child. You also see these novel utterances which have not been reinforced. So once again, the criticism of the behaviorist becomes a rationale of the nativist. So what is this intrinsic capacity for language? Well, he says in the mind, and listen how I say it, in the mind, he didn't necessarily identify a brain area at first. He just said the mind has something called the language acquisition device, which permits us to combine words together, shape grammar, say novel utterances as soon as we have sufficient vocabulary to do so. Now, the nativist approach suggests a biological underpinning. What are some support for this? Well, we tend to see this principle of universal grammar, which is a built-in storehouse of rules that apply to all human languages. So even if you're learning a different language, they tend to move in a very similar way. Sounds lead to words, words lead to sentences, sentences lead to passages, and it goes that way. So unless you're deprived of a natural environment, you're going to pick up language with minimal effort typically. So the idea of deliberate training of children to acquire language is absolutely unnecessary, according to Chomsky. So, as I said, if we were looking to use modeling and reinforcement and just look through the behaviorist point of view, then we should be able to teach other animals language. And we've worked with dolphins and parrots and gorillas, orangutans, chimpanzees. We've really tried to say, well, maybe there's a species that could fully acquire language. Ultimately, on typically, the animal model doesn't acquire language greater than the level of a 2-year-old. What about the animals like gorillas, orangutans, chimpanzees who don't have the voice box to emit sound the way we do? Well, you could teach them American Sign Language, but still, even using sign language, they don't master sign language greater than a 2 to 3-year-old. Now, here is an interesting one. Bonobo chimps are known for being among the most intelligent and social chimpanzees. So here is a study, a research study where they worked with a chimp named Kanzi. That was the nickname they gave. And they taught her an artificial language. They had picture books, as you see on the right, and they used gestures to communicate. And what did they find? Kanzi, being among the more intelligent species, was able to develop incredible comprehension of language. He was able to understand or act out unusual sentences that he never heard before, demonstrating an understanding of language. He also could reverse a command. So if you say, take the potato outside versus go outside and get the potato, Kanzi could do that. However, when it came to communicating in terms of expression of language, he still never made it beyond the 2-year-old child, like other animals. And this highlights that animals lack the ability to fully master language. It also is a criticism against the behaviorist point of view, because if it's just modeling and reinforcement, you should be able to use those strategies with other species, and they should be able to pick up language better than a 2-year-old. All right. Another argument for the nativist or biologically hardwired approach is that neuroscience adds some value here. We tend to see that there are different parts of the brain that are responsible for different aspects of speech. So Broca's area is responsible for speech and language production. So as I'm giving this lecture, if you were to hook me up to machinery, my Broca's area would light up like a Christmas tree. Now, as you're hearing this lecture, you're engaging in the process of speech and language comprehension. And when we talk about speech and language comprehension, Wernicke's area is more responsible for that. Now, Broca's area, as you can see in red on the picture, is in the frontal lobe. And Wernicke's area, as you see in purple, is in the temporal lobe. All right. Now, how about sensitive periods? So once again, this is another criticism of reinforcement. If it's purely modeling and reinforcement, it should not matter when you learn a language. You should be able to master it based on modeling and reinforcement. But what we tend to find is that when it comes to language development, the window of time, the sensitive period, is ideally birth to 6, then from 6 to about puberty. You start to have this neuroplasticity that reduces. So as the brain starts to hardwire itself, the flexibility is reduced, and that results in lesser ability to learn languages at a later point. Now, how do we know this? Well, many of you have probably heard the story of Jeannie, which was isolated from about 1.5 years old to about 13 and a half. And when she was found, she was purely nonverbal. She ate with her hands, she grunted. And this happened because her parents locked her away in the basement without any kind of interaction. So psychologists worked with her for about 4 years. And over several years of language, she started to acquire some vocabulary and comprehension, but never more than a 2 to 3 word sentence, which is roughly a 3-year-old level. Now, it's interesting because that demonstrates that there's a window of time when language is supposed to occur. If it happens outside of that window, it's going to be much harder to acquire that language. And Jeannie is a good example of that. We also see sense appeared with sign language, right? Because language is a way of communicating. It doesn't have to be verbal. It could be through signing, and that's perfectly fine. And what we tend to see is that when people try and learn sign language at a later point, they tend to uh, make more mistakes and they don't fully master sign language the same way as people who learned it at a younger age. Another study that's relevant is learning a second language and sensitive periods there. So if we were to look at individuals who uh, migrated to the United States from various countries and their relative ratings of English proficiency, we tend to see a downward trend. That as you get older, the ratings of English proficiency tend to be lower. This doesn't matter whether you're learning Spanish or, pardon me, whether you're a Spanish speaking immigrant or a Chinese speaking immigrant that's learning English, it decreases with age. It also doesn't matter um, about your level of education because every single group, their English language proficiency goes down as they get older. Now, granted, does that mean that having a college education doesn't help? Of course it does. As you see, it's at the top of the chart. But nevertheless, uh, all 5 groups drop with age. So when we talk about sensitive periods and learning a second language, there's also data for that. So it would seem at this point that the nativist point of view is a good one, right? It seems like it fully captures how language occurs, and it has a whole bunch of arguments in its favor. However, there are criticisms as well to the nativist approach. So when we talk about specifying the universal grammar that explains the various languages, uh, you know, there are questions as to whether there's one set of rules that explains all grammar. And it's pretty good what I talked to you about, but it doesn't fully explain all languages as was stated. So that's an overstatement. We also tend to see that children master language gradually, and that's inconsistent with the idea that you have this inherent knowledge. So it must be that there's some modeling or observation that's also necessary. So far, you'll see 2 theories of language development, and you'll see criticisms of both. Now, then there's the interaction perspective, which suggests that there is an interaction between heredity and your predispositions and environmental influences. This is probably the best we have. So let's look at some of the theories. You learned in lecture 7 about the information processing approach. Again, there's this belief that there are neural networks that connect and the wiring of the brain is such that the more you use a set of neurons, the more it becomes hardwired, and then the other neurons that aren't used are less likely to put an output. Now, your neural connections that we talk about learning language are not biased to actually learn language. Rather, what happens is that through your analytical capacity, you crunch the patterns that you're exposed to in your language environment, and then that becomes your language. And there's support for that, right? Because believe it or not, at birth, you could say every sound of every language, but by 1 year old, you lose sounds that you don't use. And what's the explanation? Your language environment didn't activate that. And it's sort of like, well, I don't need this. So like a computer, it filters out the important versus the unimportant components of language. We also have statistical learning theory, which is a blend of learning processing, which we talked about, and Chomsky's approach. So you're able to discriminate between the sound stream, chopping things up, as I talked about, information processing, but you're also able to recognize that statistical computations are not sufficient for higher level aspects of language. So when we say it's a combination between your environment and information processing, you still need some of that modeling. So it's still a combination between nature and nurture. All right, social interactionist theories, they argue that social skills and language experience combine with your inherent abilities to affect your language development. So some researchers think that children make sense of language through general cognitive abilities, whereas others say it's language-focused cognitive abilities. But either way, it's an interaction between your capability and your experience. So let's go to sounds, phonemes. As I said, there are 5 parts of language, and a phoneme is the smallest unit of sound that changes the meaning of a word. Things like pa versus ba. How you make that sound is based on the placement of the lips and tongue in your teeth, and that makes a difference. Now, in terms of sounds, right, that are important, each language has sounds that are important to it. For example, ra and la are different sounds in English, but Japanese children who are not exposed to it cannot readily distinguish between the two. So each language has its own sounds, and we tend to categorize speech perception in a way that sounds that are viewed as identical or very similar get put in to the same phoneme, so to speak. Now, remember how we talked about language also having an environmental piece? Well, parents have a role here. By the way, it says adult speech to young language listeners. That should be young, Y-O-U-N-G. So there's something called child-directed speech, also known as motherese, where when we speak to our young children, we speak to them very slowly with exaggerated expression and high-pitched sounds to catch their attention. Now, we don't know we're doing this. If you have pets, you do this as well, right? You start talking to it very slowly and cute and like, who's a cute little puppy? So you start speaking like that, and that actually helps capture the attention of the child, helps them break up the aspects of the sounds and acquire language. Now, we don't even know that we're doing it. So if you were to ask parents, do you talk to your kids in baby talk? Many parents would say, no, I don't do it, until they catch themselves doing it. We do the same thing, interesting to note, for non-English speakers or speaking to foreigners. We tend to speak to them very slowly using child-directed speech, which actually can be offensive at times because it's infantilizing. So the question is, we know that parents speak to their children using this child-directed speech, or what's called motherese, baby talk. The question is, do children prefer baby talk, or do they prefer to be talked to as a young child or an adult? So there was a famous study by Farrald who studied preferential looking, and he found that babies looked more towards the speaker that had motherese over normal speech. He also found that babies preferred motherese with the pauses rather than some random breaks. So long story short, you're going to speak in baby talk, and it's actually preferred by your infant. That's a good thing. So now let's talk about sounds, like how we develop language and sounds. Believe it or not, language starts even before the baby is making meaningful sounds. When you feed your child, whether it be breastfeeding or bottle feeding, and you hold that child and you look into their eyes and they look into your eyes, they're bonding with you and they're learning a form of communication, that it's important to make eye contact when speaking to a person. Then you have things called cooing and babbling. Cooing is just saying vowel sounds repeatedly, like versus babbling, you add a consonant to the vowel, so becomes ba, ba, ba. And you can hear, if you have the infant in a stroller and you're pushing them, you'll start to hear them make sounds because they're trying to acquire speech. And then we have something called expressive jargon, which starts to happen around 7 months to 10 months, and it sounds like they're starting to really talk. It's like blah, 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 blah. And it's unintelligible to you. You don't understand what they're saying, but it sounds like they're carrying on a conversation. So that happens, and then ultimately you say your first word at roughly a year old, you say your first word. Now, do deaf children babble? The answer is yes, but they babble with their hands. So they do pre-signing that appears as if they're doing sign language until they master sign language. So it's interesting whether we're talking about the spoken language or sign language or gestures, that you tend to see deaf children doing that. Now, in terms of communication, it requires joint attention. So that means that the child and the caregiver have to focus on the same object. And as they develop joint attention, they're able to comprehend more language, they're able to do gestures, meaningful gestures, they're able to show faster vocabulary development as they develop joint attention. Now, at 3 months, you will see that the caregiver and the child will speak at the same time. So they didn't learn the rules of taking turn at 3 months, but by 4 to 6 months, they start to understand turn taking and the rules of dialogue. And this might be helped by games like peekaboo or pat a cake, which teaches a give and take. And then by 9 to 12 months, infants start to engage in intentional behavior, such as proto-declaratives and proto-imperatives. A proto-declarative is sort of like, right, they hold up a bottle and they're trying to show you, hey, look, it's a bottle. Versus if they want a bottle of milk, they might point to it. That's a proto-imperative, pointing and gesturing, or opening the hand like gimme, gimme, gimme. That would be a proto-imperative. Now, phonological development, or the development of sounds. Eventually, these sounds get put together to make words, and then eventually these words get put together to make phrases. So this phonological development blossoms between the ages of 1 and 4. Now, as I said, sounds get put together to make words, and it's interesting, words that are common in the early phase are kind of words that are smaller words with repetitive sounds, like mama, dada, papa. These are usually some of the first words that a child says, because it's a very easy and repetitive sound. Now, do children understand the correct pronunciation of words, even if they can't produce it? So what you're looking at here is Swingley and Asselin. They did a study with 14-month-old children, and they were showed pictures. And for example, they were showed a picture of a baby, and in a speaker it said baby, and they measured looking time of the speaker saying baby, baby, right? And then they switched the sound with a slight mispronunciation, baby, baby, right? And the child looks at that much less, but in extreme pronunciation, it's interesting that the child will look at more than a slight mispronunciation. Raby. See, B and V are very similar sounding, but B and R are not. So the children look at the extreme mispronunciation more than a slight mispronunciation, demonstrating that they know it's a mispronunciation, which is interesting. Now, what I will say is this goes back to, in lecture 4, we talked about familiarity and novelty preferences. So the correct pronunciation operates based on a familiarity preference, and the extreme mispronunciation and looking time operates based on a novelty preference, which is, hey, that's not right. That doesn't seem appropriate. So even though the children may not have said the word baby, they understood it. So now we move to the middle of the second year, and children are starting to pronounce whole syllables. They're trying to make each of the sounds in a word correctly, whereas at about 1.5, 2 years old, they're still making some errors. So part of the word they'll say correctly, part of the word they will say incorrectly as they're learning the sounds. So now let's move from syllables to words, and how the process works at this point. So it starts with minimal words. So they might say ju for juice, or raff for giraffe, saying one syllable. Now, as they get older, they add things to it. So they might say Jews, right? And they add the S. It's not Jews, it's juice, right? But they add the end consonants, or they say B, right, for please, because B and P are sounds that are familiar. Or they might start to add the unstressed syllable, like mado for tomato, and so forth. And eventually they say a full word with the correct stress syllable by 3 or 4 years old, and then it gets further refined during preschool. Now, as you get older, so we're looking at 5 years old to about adolescence, now we start to learn things like homophones and how it has the same sound but has a different meaning. So if you were to use the word, I'm walking to the corner until I get to the greenhouse, you would understand that green is a descriptor of the house. It's a color versus I'm walking into the greenhouse. And the greenhouse would be where you grow plants, right? So it's interesting that the sounds are the same, but you're able to make the subtle differences in meaning based on it. Now that brings us to semantic development. Semantic development refers to language comprehension. That starts to begin at the middle of your first year. You say, on average, your first word about 12 months old. Now, granted, there is a range, and we typically expect people to say their first words anywhere between 12 to 18 months. If your child is nonverbal at 18 months, consider ruling out hearing problems, neurological problems, whether the child's on the autism spectrum, all of these things you want to rule out, because it's expected that your child is supposed to speak at 12 months. Now, by 6 years old, the word bank or vocabulary bank of children on average is about 10,000 words. And in order to do this, you have to acquire 5 new words a day. Now, you don't start off acquiring 5 new words a day. You start slowly, and then you have a word explosion, and you acquire a massive amount of words afterwards. Now, we talked about Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Comprehension refers to understanding language. That's Wernicke's area. And production is Broca's area. And what we find is that there's anywhere between a 5 to 6 month lag between language comprehension and production. So you might understand 50 words by 13 months, but it'll take about 18 months until you're able to say 50 distinct words. Now, as I said, you need to, on average, learn 5 words a day to get to that 10,000 word bank by 6 years old. But you don't start off that way, right? So you start off very slowly and the rate goes faster. So there's something called a word explosion, which your book uses the phrase spurt in vocabulary, where once you get going, you on average start to acquire as many as 9 new words a day, which is incredible. Now, so the question becomes, well, how is it possible for children to build their word bank or their vocabulary so quickly? Well, as you get older, you have increased ability to organize and categorize, and we're constantly putting people and things into boxes. Our memory gets better. We start to be able to produce and pronounce the words. We also start to observe other people and learn their intention, which helps us conceptualize what a word means based on the context. We increase our labeling and we have greater self-awareness. All of these factors build vocabulary. But last but not least, we have something called fast mapping. So this is a child's cognitive ability to connect a new word with an underlying concept, even with a split in second or a brief encounter. Naturally does that. But there are differences, right? There are individual differences and there are cultural differences. So you're supposed to say your first word at 12 months, but the range is much broader. Notice I gave you to 18 months, right? So some people might say the word early at 8 months, or they might say it later at 18 months. And that's due to a combination of nature and nurture, genetic and environmental factors. We also tend to see that there are gender differences, but that doesn't mean you should write off language delays because of that. because we tend to see that girls develop language quicker, but by the age of 2, boys should catch up. Now, your personality or temperament also plays a role. So people who are more introverted or reserved tend to speak at a later age. Um, and that's how temperament plays a role. Now, moms tend to talk to their toddler girls more than boys. That might play a role. We talked about introversion, extroversion, but the more words that the caregivers use, the quicker it's acquired in children's vocabulary. So, long story short, talk to your kids. They're going to pick up the language. And we tend to see people who have higher socioeconomic statuses tend to have greater vocabulary. And that should not shock you, because in lecture 8, we talked about socioeconomic status having to do with education, levels of education, prestige of one's job, and financial outcomes, but the education plays a role. Now, there are different types of communication styles. There's a referential style and then an expressive style. When we talk about a referential style, this is more focusing on naming things, nouns and objects. An expressive style is more about feelings and social formulas. So when you're acquiring that word bank, remember how we talked about acquiring words and expressing words? Well, what are the kind of words you're going to express? The most commonly expressed type of word are objects or things. So we're talking about nouns. What are examples that you hear? Apple, ball, bird, cookie, dada, doggy, things like that that are commonly shown in a child's world. After nouns, then we have verbs or action words, things like look, more, out, right? Things like that. Then we have state words, which are qualifiers. So all gone, things like that. And then emotional expressions, ouchie, and then function words, which are grammar. But look at the percentage. It's in that order, the typical toddler's 50-word vocabulary. Now, we also tend to see overextensions and underextensions when it comes to language. An underextension would be where a child uses a word too narrowly. So if they say, I want my blanket, and you give them a blanket and they say, this is not a blanket because it's not their favorite blanket, right? Or an overextension is everything that has wheels is a car. That would be using it more extended than it should. Then we have things called word coinages, where using things like the plant man because they don't know the word gardener yet, or metaphors. There's a fire engine in my tummy. That could either mean a stomach ache, that could mean a stomach ulcer, or it could mean that the kid is hungry. Now, 6 to 10 and 11 plus, we continue to see a spike. So by the 3rd grade, you have a vocab of roughly 20,000 words. And by the 5th grade or 11 years old, you have about 40,000 words on average. And by 11, remember, you have abstract thinking, so you can understand things like irony and sarcasm. So memory plays a role. We talked about the phonological store, which is using working memory to acquire speech and language production. So by 5, you start to demonstrate semantic knowledge. We also have things called lexical contrast theory, which is how do we acquire words? Well, we look at 2 things, conventionality versus contrast. So conventionality is that children try to acquire words and the word meanings based on the community. And then contrast is they try and pit one word against another based on the words they already know. and whether that word is similar or dissimilar to them. Now, what's the criticism? Well, one criticism is that lexical contrast theory doesn't fully explain how we determine new word meanings. So there's a mutual exclusivity bias that assumes that these words go into one category or another, but that's not always true. There could be synonyms or subtleties. And then we have something called syntactical bootstrapping, which is another thing where you might learn the meaning of a word by figuring out by reading the whole sentence. That's another criticism. So now let's move to grammar. So by about 1.5 to 2 years old, you're engaging in something called telegraphic speech. So you're putting words together. And now we need to start acquiring grammar and syntax. So very commonly, you have a noun verb pairing, an agent and an action. Tommy hit, or a command, give cookie. So these are how we put it together. So we might put nouns, a noun and a verb together, a noun and an adjective together, a verb and an adverb together. But when we put two nouns together, it creates confusion, and there can be errors in speech based on that. So if I were to say two words, ball, sky, I don't think I've given you enough context to figure out what that sentence is. Whereas hit ball, that might make sense based on the context. Or falling ball, things like that, it makes more sense. But ball sky, you don't know whether you're talking about the sun. You don't know if the ball is in the sky, the ball is falling from the sky. So that's a problem. Now, when we put sentences together, we start very simplistically at an age of 2.5 to 3.5. We put 2-3 words together. And then eventually, we start to learn how to connect words together, connect sentences, but we don't always apply it universally. In fact, the English language has many exceptions to the rule. So you open something with scissors. Now let's use the word with in the next sentence. He hit me with a stick. So notice you need another word. It's not always consistent. So then we have things like grammatical morphemes, which are things like possessives and whatnot. And it gets more complex in structure and semantics. Now, we also, when we're putting grammar together, we make mistakes too. We have overregulation, where if we want to talk past tense, right? So if something breaks, right, the past tense you might think is braked, when in reality, my car broke would be the correct grammar. But we learn ED is a morphological rule that means that it's past tense. And we make that mistake until we learn the unwritten rules too. Now, how do we figure out how to put sentences together? This is the reverse of what we've previously said. And now we're talking about semantic bootstrapping. So figuring out a sentence structure by understanding the meaning of a word. So that's one way we do it. Now, in terms of how does grammatical development occur? So Chomsky would say, well, we're hardwired to pick it up. Others would argue that it's modeled for us. Parents oftentimes give feedback. So one of the ways that we acquire language and modify our language is through things like recast, which is to take a sentence and then restate it in a meaningful way. without grammatical errors. So you might correct the mistakes. You also engage in expansions, which is to kind of elaborate on what's being said to build the narrative or storyline so that they can increase conversation that way. But notice how this feedback is not innate, it's depending on guidance from others. Now, pragmatic language, which is the last part of language, these are the unwritten rules of language, such as eye contact, verbal exchanges, sarcasm, things of that nature. And we start to demonstrate some rules of pragmatics even by the age of 2. So, what are some conversational strategies we use? One that we see in preschoolers is something called a turnabout, which is when a person not only responds to what's being said, but then they add something to the conversation to get their partner to respond again. So turnabout is sort of like hot potato, but with a conversation. I'm saying something, I pass it to you with something else, and you say something, pass it back, and you build conversation by adding to it. Then you have shading. So as you get to 5 to 9, you might want to avoid certain topics. So you learn to gradually move the discussion from one topic to another. So that's what we call shading. Then we have something called illocutionary content, which is sometimes when a person says something that's not really what they mean, and you have to figure out what they mean. So here are 2 examples. If someone says to you, I need a pencil, you might say, wow, that's really terrible. I'm sorry. No, what are they really saying? Could you please give me a pencil? So they're not declaring that they need a pencil. They're actually asking you for a pencil in that statement. Or if they say, well, the garbage is starting to smell, what are they really doing in that statement? They're actually asking you to take out the garbage. And we also have issues of referential style. So this is a common issue depending on the age. So Hurwitz did a study where he took 4-year-old and 5-year-olds and said the following phrase: put the frog on the book in the box. And what he found was they got stuck with the first inference, which was to put the frog on the empty book. But there was a comma there was a clause there, which they were saying, hey, there's already a frog on the book that I want you to put in a box. But they couldn't figure that out. We only start to pick that up around middle childhood, so 6 years old or above. Now, narratives, when we tell stories, narratives, they start with preschoolers where they bounce from topic to topic in an uncoordinated fashion. That's called leapfrog narratives. By 4 or 5, they tell stories in a chronological order, first and next. And then by 6 and above, you tell very detailed stories with some kind of challenge, some plot, some conflict, and some resolution. So this is a simple story. We went to the lake and caught a fish. After we cleaned it, we cooked it, right? So that's a story, but it implies the need to catch the fish, the struggle to catch the fish, and ultimately catching it, and then what happened next. So the resolution. All right, so let's talk about bilingualism. Bilingualism is the acquisition of 2 or more languages. So you can become bilingual in multiple ways. One way to be bilingual is to learn 2 languages at the same time. And another way is to acquire a second language after mastering the first. Now, what's interesting is we tend to see that birth to 6 is a wonderful sensitive period for language. So if you're learning multiple languages at the same time, by 6, you will fully master it. Now, if you try and learn one language than the other, it takes a little bit longer to acquire that second language. It's an additional 3 to 5 years to become competent. So when people are worried, oh, I don't want to teach my kid multiple languages, they're going to have language delays. It's actually not true. We find kids who learn multiple languages tend to have better cognitive skills, better attention skills, analytical skills, and mental flexibility. So I would argue teach your child multiple languages at the same time, and you'll see by the age of 6, they'll fully master it. Now, what are you looking at here? You're looking at the various milestones in the various parts of speech, all the way from birth to adulthood. And that is our lecture for today. So I'm going to stop there.